I call the
Chair?
meeting to order.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm so sorry, Chair. I'm just wondering if you can hear me. I haven't used my headphones in a really long time. I'm wondering if we're doing sound checks today?
Yeah, I did not know that they had not been done. I got into the room about 7 or 8 minutes ago. So the interpreter gave me a thumbs up on your audio. So I hope that everyone else is using their their regular equipment and that will be okay without individual sound checks. So I will call I have called the meeting to order then, and bienvenue à la réunion numéro 29.
Welcome to meeting 29 of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics of the House of Commons.
1064. The committee is meeting at the request of members to discuss their request to undertake a study of device investigation tools used by the RCMP. Interpretation is available, as you all know, and we don't have any other witnesses. All of you, I think, know how this all works, so I'll dispense with the rest of it. And proceed then to Monsieur Villemure, who I understand from the letter has a motion that he would like us to entertain. So I will, with that, give the floor to Monsieur Villemure.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to submit a motion which reads as follows: that the committee undertake a study of at least 4 meetings beginning no later than Monday, August 8th, 2022, to determine and identify which device investigation tools are being used by the RCMP, which have technical capabilities similar to Pegasus, and provide the committee with the names of such software and the terms and conditions of its use. That the committee request by Thursday, August 4th, that the RCMP provide a list of warrants obtained, if any, for each of such software, as well as the scope of warrants and the reason for the monitoring. That the committee also request by Thursday, August 4th, 2022, a list of warrants or any other information related to the wiretapping of members of Parliament, parliamentary assistants, or any other employee of the Parliament of Canada. That, to this end, the witness list for this study include, but not be limited to, RCMP officers who have decided on the use of device investigation tools, or any other surveillance tools, the Minister of Public Safety, the current and former Privacy Commissioners of Canada, Mrs. Sharon Polsky, Privacy Specialist, Privacy and Access Council for Canada, and that any additional witness lists be submitted to the clerk of the committee within 7 days of the adoption of this motion.
Chair?
Discussion. Yes, Ikra, go ahead.
My apologies. Sorry, it's been a long time since I've used these headphones. I'm wondering if Monsieur Villemure would be kind enough to also read out the motion in English, just so that we have it on record, and if there's any translation glitches.
Okay, just let me before I ask Monsieur Villemure if he would care to do so. This is a bilingual committee, and members are not obliged to read their motions in both languages. Either language is an acceptable way to present a motion. So his motion, as read, is in order and was actually circulated in the letter and was orally translated just now. So I don't want us to go down that road where we ask committee members to translate their own work, but yeah, Renee, if you know, I'll leave it up to you. But I would discourage this as a general practice. And go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Yeah, just on that point of order, I'd just say that would be a dangerous practice to undertake, because I'd hate to have to read a motion in both English and in French. knowing that my French capabilities are extremely limited.
All right.
So I think it's a dangerous precedent.
Okay. I could see on my screen it looked like Ms. Shanahan was trying to get my attention. I would encourage, please, members, use the hands up feature on Zoom. It's much easier for me as chair to do it that way, but I did see you waving, so go ahead, Ms. Shanahan.
Just a technical point of order. There's a lot of background noise, and I didn't do a sound check either, so I don't know if it's timely to do so now. Could avoid future problems, but there was a lot of background noise.
Sometimes when a microphone and if there's lag between the disconnection of my microphone, that will likely create some feedback, but I hope everybody's audio is good now. If there's anybody that is having trouble understanding me in either language, please let me know now. And Ms. Shanahan, you came through very loud and clear. I was listening to you in English, so I presume there was no translation problem. I would like to get to the substance of this and not. If there are problems, by all means, identify them, but I don't want to go looking for them with respect to the translation as well. If there's a problem with translation that has been identified, let us know, but I'd like to continue with the meeting. So I see you also have your hand up again, Ms. Shanahan. Would you like to speak to the motion? Or do you have okay.
Yes, I would. Indeed, I would like to take this opportunity, Chair, to read out the motion as I have it in English, and that the record be corrected if it's not indeed not the proper wording. And so the motion that Mr. Villemeur has put before this committee is that the committee undertake a study of at least 4 meetings beginning no later than Monday, August 8th, 2022, to determine and identify which device investigation tools are being used by the RCMP, which have technological capabilities similar to Pegasus, and provide the committee with the names of such software and the terms and conditions of its use. That the committee request by Thursday, August 4th, 2022, that the RCMP provide a list of warrants obtained, if any, for each use of such software, as well as the scope of the warrants and the reasons for the monitoring. That the committee also request by Thursday, August 4th, 2022, a list of warrants or any other information related to the wiretapping of members of Parliament, parliamentary assistants, or any other employee of the Parliament of Canada. That to this end, the witness list for this study include, but not be limited to, RCMP officers who have decided on the use of device investigation tool or any other surveillance tools, the Minister of Public Safety, the current and former Privacy Commissioners of Canada, Ms. Sharon Polsky, Privacy Specialist, Privacy and Access Council on Canada, and that any additional witness list be submitted to the clerk of the committee within 7 days of the adoption of this motion, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House by September 19, 2022. Chair, I would ask the clerk to confirm that that is indeed the English translation of this motion.
Yes, that indeed is correct. So thank you. And now, Monsieur Villemeur.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm wondering what the purpose of this exercise is, because we all received the motion in both official languages ahead of time, unless people are trying to find some little quirk in it.
Thank you.
Chair, may I answer? Yeah.
Well, all right. You may, but didn't. That sounded somewhat rhetorical. But anyway, go ahead, Ms. Shanahan, if you'd care to answer.
Mais justement, pour rassurer.
Well, to reassure my colleague, I'll say that we've seen this sort of problem in other committees when the translation wasn't accurate. So it's quite normal to go through this kind of exercise at the beginning of the study of a motion to make sure we understand it properly and that both motions in French and English be exactly the same. Thank you.
Any further discussion on, or any discussion on the motion itself? Ms. Khalid.
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering if Monsieur Villemure could walk us through the intent of the motion, the purpose, and why it is the dates as proposed, just as part of the discussion on the main motion. From our side, with the Liberals, we have had discussions with all parties, and all parties know that we will be potentially moving 3 amendments. But I would like to start this conversation by understanding Monsieur Villemure's objectives with this motion, if that's okay.
Monsieur Villemure, you're welcome to address Ms. Khalid's questions if you'd like.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai pas reçu d'amendement.
Thank you, Chairman. I didn't receive any amendment. I didn't get any amendment formally. But this motion follows a series of articles in La Presse newspaper, and there were questions put in the House of Commons, and there was a doubt that remained as to the non-authorized monitoring by the RCMP of parliamentarians. So I'm not someone who engages in witch hunts, but I think that privacy is fundamental. You know, this motion is not partisan. What we want is to serve the public interest. So to allow for doubt on this kind of a significant motion, I think in order to deal with this, we have to talk to people who were directly responsible, if responsibility there was. And in order to give a bit of background, Pegasus is a software which is used by several countries to monitor and survey. This software has a rather shady reputation. When the journalist put the question to the RCMP asking if they used Pegasus, they said, we use a software which allows us to investigate, which allows for device investigation. I wanted to have the opportunity to put the question directly, if this is the case. Is this the case? And if so, how do you engage in this and why? I'm sure the RCMP engages in best practices in these matters. And are they provided, as a policy, are they provided with best practices in the matter? Because we want to have confidence in the National Police Force.
Next, I have Ms. Shanahan. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. I listened with great interest to the points that were being made by Monsieur Villemure, and indeed there are concerns. We have heard about them. I was a previous member of this committee, Chair, and so I know that there have been concerns in the past, and I do congratulate the committee on proceeding with the facial recognition study, which I haven't followed very closely, but I'll be looking forward to that report and to that study. That's very important work for this committee. But I do fail to understand some of the requests in this motion, notably the request for the Minister of Public Safety to appear, and so I'm well aware, having served on other committees, that there is operational independence. The Minister of Public Safety, his or her role is unique in that the agencies that are the oversight of the Minister of Public Safety do not directly report. There is operational independence. I think that we are familiar with that term, and that this is so it would not be pertinent. There is not. There is, from what I can see, any information that the Minister of Public Safety can offer us, but I will leave that. I'm new to this committee on this session, so but I do think that the relevance of the Minister of Public Safety here in this inquiry is not relevant. Thank you, Chair.
Next, I have Mr. Bazan. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our colleague, Mr. Villemure, for coming forward with this motion and requesting this emergency meeting that us as Conservative members supported. This is an issue that I think we need to delve into. When you look at this Pegasus malware, which is not just a hacking application, that this software also is spyware and has the ability to turn on our microphones on our smartphones, turn on our cameras to spy on us and others. And we know that the RCMP are saying that they have used it in the traditional sense of the wiretap. But this goes way beyond any wiretapping technology that's existed until the advent of Pegasus. And we know that there's other software out there as well. So I think it is inherent upon us as committee members to dig into this, to see how the RCMP has been using it, to even look at what other police agencies are doing with this type of technology across Canada and elsewhere. And, the one thing that is concerning is whether or not it's been used against us as members of Parliament to monitor us, to listen into our conversations, to whether or not knowing our places that we meet that aren't public are now being shared amongst people with malicious intent. And I think that we have to be consider all those avenues. To go to Ms. Shanahan's comment about the Minister of Public Safety, I think ultimately the RCMP have to report to the Minister of Public Safety. And when we're dealing in new technology that goes beyond the scope of what we have available under rules and regulations and legislation that we have as a country, then the Minister of Public Safety, I would have hoped, would be informed on what type of technologies are being used by the National Police Force. So having the Minister of Public Safety appear to give testimony to committee to explain what the government does or does not know is important to the overall work that we want to undertake. We need to know how this has been deployed across government agencies as well. And so that comes down to the Minister of Public Safety is responsible for it. Is CSE under National Defense making use of this technology? Is it being deployed not only against adversaries, but is it being used against our own citizens and us as national legislators, or even provincial and municipal politicians as well? So we need to take a harder look at this, and I think that the sooner we get started, the better. We can do this over a short period of time, multiple meetings per day over a couple of days. We should be able to get through all these witnesses and not take up a lot of summertime for us being in our constituencies right now, especially being the first summer back in our ridings since the mandates have ended, allowing us to get out to our community events and meet with our constituents face to face. So I will be supporting this and not too crazy about making any major amendments to the motion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bazin. Et maintenant, Madame Brière.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Pour toutes les raisons qui ont été mentionnées,
For all the reasons mentioned by Ms. Shanahan and Mr. Bazin, I'd like to propose the following motion, that the main motion be amended by removing that the minister be called as a witness.
Thank you, Madame Brière. We have an amendment. The amendment is in order. And so I will now take debate on the amendment. I see Monsieur Villemure, who had his hand up before, but we're now debating also debating the amendment. Go ahead, Monsieur Villemure.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. For the reasons given by Mr. Bazin, the minister is ultimately responsible, and his appearance is absolutely relevant. I think that these are things, and I've said since the beginning that this investigation, well, I called the members of all parties, and I talked about an investigation that is of public interest, and I didn't want to be partisan. But now we've had 3 answers from colleagues across the way who seem to want to perhaps narrow the scope. And I think for parliamentary unanimity, we shouldn't limit the scope before we know more about it. So I'd like to see some goodwill cooperation here.
After you, I had Ms. Khalid. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to echo something that Mr. Bazin said and what Mr. Villemure has said as well, and that is, this is definitely an important issue. If members are bringing this up, I'm sure that there is importance here for us to find out exactly what kind of operational challenges the RCMP is or may be or may not be endeavoring into and ensuring the protection of privacy of Canadians. And that, to me, based on my reading of this motion, is what the ultimate intent is, although it's not very clear. So, when we're trying to get through and receive as much information as possible, in my opinion, I really think that, given all of the points that the motion is asking for, these are operational decisions that the minister would just not be involved in, his day-to-day operations of the RCMP. I would rather, if we are going to go down this path of this motion, that we spend that time dealing with the operational piece of it and getting the information that Monsieur Villemure really wants to get at, and would rather spend that time in questioning or receiving that information from those that are actually relevant to the topic of this motion. So obviously I'll support this amendment, removing the Minister of Public Safety from that list of witnesses and going from there. Thanks, Chair.
Now, Mr. Nakvi, and after him, it'll be Mr. Bazin.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I also want to build on what both Monsieur Villemure and Ms. Khalid are saying, which is this is a non-partisan issue, and I totally agree with Monsieur Villemure on that. This is an important issue, and Canadians should know whether or not their police services are complying with all the legislation as it relates to their privacy exists, are being followed. In order for this committee to do that work, it is important that we focus on the operational aspect of what does RCMP does or does not do. As soon as you inject bringing in somebody like the Minister of Public Safety into that conversation, I think you're trying to make the issue a partisan issue. Because we know, and all of us have said in many committees, the line of questioning that takes place, especially when we know that the Minister of Public Safety will not have any information or knowledge as to what kind of software, if it's being used by the RCMP, for instance, in this particular matter, because it is an operational matter. I've had the opportunity to serve as Minister of Public Safety in the province of Ontario, under which Ontario Provincial Police reports to. And I can tell you that that's the kind of information a minister, even at the provincial level, will have no information or will not be privy to at all, because it is so down to operational. And even if a minister had asked the commissioner of a police service, whether it's RCMP or OPP or Sûreté de Québec, the likelihood of that commissioner telling the minister, sorry, sir or madam, you do not have the right to ask me those questions because these are operational matters, are extremely high. Because that will be the response, because the minister will be out of place, out of bound, asking those type of operational questions. And so I do support Ms. Brier's motion that we remove Minister of Public Safety from this proceeding, given this is a highly operational matter, and it's probably best that those who are aware of how those operations works, i.e. members of the RCMP, for example, are the ones who've been asked to testify, as opposed to bringing the minister who is more on the executive side, on the political side, and is responsible for policies, not the actual operations of our National Police Service. Thank you.
Mr. Bazan, followed by Monsieur Villemeux.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm opposed to this amendment, and mainly on the issue that the Liberal members keep arguing that this is an operational question. There is a policy vacuum here, and this is why we need to talk to the Minister of Public Safety. Ultimately, the RCMP reports to him or her, whoever the Minister of Public Safety is at the time. This goes back over a number of years, so we're not even concerned about this current Minister of Public Safety. It's about the general policy direction that was given by the Government of Canada through the Minister of Public Safety's office to the RCMP about how you deal with privacy issues around this technology. This spyware, Pegasus in particular, has huge sweeping impacts upon the privacy of Canadians. And we also want to make sure that charter rights have been protected. Again, this comes down to the responsibility of the minister to ensure that warrants have been issued or ministerial authorization were given in extreme circumstances if they're investigating an individual at a certain point in time that was a national security threat or someone that is a threat to the public safety of Canadians. And so, whether talking about transnational criminal organizations, drug gangs, terrorist organizations, the Minister of Public Safety has a huge role to play there and has ministerial authority over all those. And if they were, going to do a wiretap on a lot of those cases, they would have gone to the Minister of Public Safety for authorization if a judge wasn't available to make those warrants applicable. And so I would just say that there is a major role for the Minister of Public Safety to play in the policy, as well as in some of the issuing of authorizations to wiretap, to spy, and to use malware such as Pegasus. So we do need to hear from the Minister of Public Safety.
And now, Monsieur Villemeux.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. All the arguments put forward are valid. Nevertheless, with respect to facial recognition, we didn't ask for the minister because it was strictly operational, but the operational use of software like Pegasus is truly concerning because this goes beyond anything we've seen heretofore. I'd like to know if the minister is aware, and we should make him aware if he's not. This kind of tool, this device investigation tool, is something quite other from an operational or policy or political point of view. Did the RCMP decide to use this on their own without discussing it with anyone? The minister should know. We're in another category here. We're not dealing with facial recognition. We're sort of in something like Minority Report. So in the public interest, and for accountability purposes, and for the necessary confidence we should have in government, we have to have the ability to call the witness to call the minister to appear.
Simplement rappeler
I'd simply like to remind everyone that it is the RCMP commissioner who has authority with respect to the RCMP and is responsible to the minister, but is autonomous and independent when it comes to operational things. So there's a line that we should not cross.
All right. Seeing no other speakers, the question is, well, you're right on the wire there, Renee, but are you, did you have something you needed to get in, or can we proceed to the vote?
J'aimerais ajouter un point sur le commentaire de Mme Brière.
I'd like to add one point following on what Ms. Brière said. The minister is not supposed to be informed of everything the RCMP does. But with the convoys this year, the minister said he was informed. I think that this is a very porous thing.
I will go to the question on the amendment. So we're voting on the amendment. We're in hybrid, so I'm wondering how the easiest way to do this. I guess I'll just put it out. Is there anyone opposed to the amendment? If there are members opposed to the amendment, opposed. All right, then we will go to a vote. Recorded vote. All right, Madam Clerk, we'll have a recorded vote on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Baines.
I vote yes.
Madame Brière.
I vote yes.
Mr. Nakvi.
Yes.
Ms. Khalid, sorry.
I vote yes.
Ms. Shanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Bazan.
Opposed.
Mr. Shields.
Opposed.
Mr. Williams.
I vote no.
Monsieur Villemur.
Je suis contre.
And Mr. Green.
I vote against.
Yeas pour 5, 5, nays contre 5, 5.
Right, and with that, I vote against the amendment.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
Okay, the amendment is defeated, which returns us to the main motion. And I have first Mr. Nakvi and followed by Ms. Khalid.
Thank you, Chair. I'm also want to make move a motion that I move that the main motion be amended by replacing at least 4 meetings with no more than 2 meetings in the first line of the motion. Thank you.
The amendment is in order. Madam Clerk, you have the amendment.
No more than 2 meetings instead of at least 4 meetings, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Discussion. Ms. Khalid.
Thanks, Chair. Maybe I'll let Mr. Bazan go first, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Thanks, Ms. Khalid. I'll just say that I do believe that we want to be productive in our time that we meet. I would suggest that we do this in a matter of days rather than meetings. I would suggest that I'll move a sub-amendment that we undertake a study of no more than 2 days. And just to speak to that, that the days would then give us the ability to have meetings in the morning and afternoon on 2 days, so we can get the 4 meetings in at a bare minimum. We can also go, instead of 2-hour meetings, we can go with 3-hour time frames in the mornings and afternoons, so that we can call the appropriate witnesses and get the information. And that way we are being productive with our time, maximizing for our time that we spend in Ottawa for those of us that want to travel to Ottawa for these hearings, and are able to call all the witnesses that Mr. Villemure has proposed, as well as any additional witnesses that other committee members want to also call to the committee meetings.
The amendment, sub-amendment, is also in order. And then the next hand I see is Ms. Khalid. So we are going to debate now the sub-amendment, and go right ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair. Now, in principle, I'm okay with this sub-amendment, just given that we get it all done all at once. But I do have some questions with respect to timing as it relates to the critical infrastructure upgrades that are happening in the next week, I believe, in the House, and also, with respect to how many hours in the day does Mr. Bazan seem to propose? I would like to run as efficient meetings as possible, instead of, like if something can be covered within 4 hours, like if we have 4 witnesses for the first morning and then 4 for the afternoon, just 4 hours, in my opinion, would be more than sufficient to exhaust the list of witnesses as listed in this motion. I don't think that we need a span of 8 meetings. I don't know how Mr. Bazan feels about that. But maybe to you, Mr. Chair, first, and maybe to the clerk to find out if the upgrades from the House is going to impact the outcome of this conversation.
Before I turn to the clerk to answer the question about meeting about availability, I'm just going to note from the chair that Mr. Bazan's sub-amendment is still an up to proposal, as was the original motion. So just regarding your point of
Sorry, I don't understand, Mr. Chair. What exactly is the sub-amendment that we're looking at right now?
Okay, the sub-amendment was that the 4 meetings that are contained in the original motion be conducted over a period of not more than 2 days, so that we condense the time and don't stretch the study out during the summer period. So that is the sub-amendment, is to just clarify that if we have up to 4 meetings, that they be conducted only over 2 days, by having meetings in the morning and the afternoon. One meeting number 1 in the morning of one day, meeting number 2 in the afternoon of the same day. The second day of the study, have 1 meeting in the morning, 1 meeting in the afternoon. That's what the sub-amendment would do, would restrict the number of days over which up to 4 meetings be spread. So I hope that clarified Mr. Bazan's motion.
Sorry, Chair, that sounds more like an amendment as opposed to a sub-amendment, because the amendment that Mr. Naqvi has proposed is asking for no more than 2 meetings, and we know that each meeting is 2 hours. And in principle, I'm not opposed to having both of those meetings in the same day, morning and afternoon. But I think dragging this on for 8 hours is a bit much, given the list of witnesses that we have before us. I think we can get it done in 4, if we're judicious with our time and ensure that our witnesses are lined up as well, and obviously being very mindful of House resources, as I know that there are other committees meeting as well.
fact, just before I have the clerk try to answer, or I ask the clerk to answer your second part of the question, I just want to go back to now whether or not this sub-amendment is in order the way I understood it. Because yes, Ms. Khalid, you're correct. The amendment says no more than 2 meetings. The sub-amendment still talked about having 4. So, Madam Clerk, can you?
No. Actually, Mr. Chair, my sub-amendment was to change to no more than 2 days. So the word meetings changes to days. That's the only change in the sub-amendment to the amendment. And just to further on that, I don't want to try to micromanage the work that the chair and the clerk and the analysts have to do in organizing witnesses and panels of witnesses. So I want to keep that open and provide that flexibility so that we can be, targeted and focused when we are sitting together. And that will include how many hours we sit during those 2 days. I'll leave that to the discretion of the chair.
Thank you. The sub-amendment is in order, and I'm just going to throw out, Madam Clerk, are you in a position to comment on the system upgrades and any of the blackout days? Do we know what those dates are as far as availability?
I can't comment on
okay.
that. No.
All right. So there may be a suggestion, if I may. I'm not sure how we'll do this because we have a sub-amendment and an amendment already on the floor, but the words subject to availability of meeting resources would be a way to deal with that. But
add that later, Mr. Chair, to another amendment to the motion.
All right. Well, then I will continue with the sorry. Perhaps, Mr. Bazan, I will, as chair, I'm going to seek unanimous consent to add the words subject to the availability of House resources to the sub-amendment. Are there any opposed to adding those words to Mr. Bazan's sub-amendment?
Sorry, Chair, do you mind if I seek clarification from the clerk on this? So I realize that the blackout dates are August 2nd to 5th, which means that we need to hold our meetings before the end of this week so we can meet the August 8th timeline that is proposed in the motion. Is that correct?
I am not sure if the first part of that is correct, that those blackout dates are in fact preclude us from holding a meeting during that time. So no, I don't believe the clerk is prepared to comment on that. So we would need, according to the motion, to commence the study by August 8th. That is contained in the motion. And I thank Mr. Bazan for his confidence in the chair and the clerk to manage the schedule if we get to it. And I don't want to do a whole committee discussion around dates and scheduling the actual meetings. I'm going to really strongly discourage that. But I see, Monsieur. So I didn't hear an objection to the words to my proposal to add.
I did object.
Oh, all right. Well, then.
So I'll just say this, Mr. Chair. I'm getting a lot of feedback here, but so I'll just say this: that we should add that, but we should do that as a separate amendment because that affects more than just the first part of this motion. It affects the entire motion.
Fair enough. So there is no consent for my proposed change to the sub-amendment. We are still on the sub-amendment. The next speaker I had for debate on the sub-amendment was and is Monsieur Villemeux. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. We shouldn't confuse these two levels. There's the organization of meetings, and then there's the question of the number of meetings. These are two different things. The 4 meetings provided for meant 8 hours of hearings. Now, if we can do it in 2 days, I have no objection. But we shouldn't paint ourselves into a corner because there are witnesses who may not be able to be available on certain dates. So this is organization. But our 4 meetings would make up 8 hours. If we want to divide them otherwise, that's fine. But 8 hours. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Your hand is still up. I don't know if you're trying to get back in or if that was left from before. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just again, seeking clarity. So when the sub-amendment right now says 2 days as a replacement of 2 meetings. And no more than 2 meetings. Now, are we contemplating how long these meetings are going to, or how long like these 2 days are going to be, or is that just at your discretion, Chair, and the discretion of the clerk, or based on the number of witnesses? I obviously would like to have a little bit of clarity as to what exactly we're going to be voting on soon.
Is exactly what Mr. Bazan said, that indeed if we have them over 2 days, then I as chair would have the flexibility to, if we can get all the witnesses and we need to have, we have to have 8 hours of meetings to accommodate it all, that we do it over 2 days. We can meet morning and afternoon over those 2 days, and or flexibility to have longer than 2 meetings that go longer than 2 hours. Many committees will meet for 3. So I think that you're correct, and that Mr. Bazan's amendment merely would give flexibility to the chair over exactly how many hours would be required to do this study, but that it be limited to 2 days rather than sort of 2-hour meetings. So, and Mr. Bazan, you're welcome to comment further if I didn't capture that accurately. Otherwise, I see no other hands up, and if that is good for you, Ikra, and there's no other comments, we'll go to a vote on the sub-amendment.
Just give me a second to confer with my colleagues if that's okay, Chair.
So yeah, that's fair. But just to make it quick, our time is going to march on. We're particularly if you have other amendments that you wish to propose.
Okay, Chair, we're ready to vote.
All right. So we're voting on the sub-amendment. Madam Clerk, I'll ask you to, I presume that there's general desirability of a recorded vote in this. All right, I see nodding of heads. All right, go ahead with the vote, Madam Clerk.
Thank you. Mr. Baines.
Yes.
Madame Brière. Madame Brière. Okay.
Chair, we did see that Madame Brière was logged off. I think she's having technical problems.
Okay, we invite her to contact either technical support or the committee as possible. But I can't stop a vote once it's commenced. So okay. I'll have the clerk continue with the vote, and we'll hopefully get Madame Brière back on.
Mr. Nakvi.
Yes.
Mr. Sorry, Madame Khalid. Mr. Khalid. Sorry, Miss Khalid.
Thank you, Clerk. It'll be a yes for me.
Thank you. Ms. Shanahan.
Oui.
Mr. Bazan.
Yes.
Mr. Shields.
Yes.
Mr. Williams,
Yes.
Monsieur Villemur,
Oui.
Mr. Green.
Yes.
Thank you. 9 yeas.
Thank you. Has anybody been able to find out what happened to Madame Briere?
Technical team is reaching out.
Technical team is reaching out to her. Okay, I'm going to carry on with the meeting because we just simply don't have a lot of time available or extra time to lose to a technical issue like this. Hopefully she can get back on as soon as possible. There I see her image appearing, so that's good. With that, we will go to, so the sub-amendment has now, now we're on the amendment itself, which is now, does the sub-amendment actually,
I'm sorry, 1 moment.
yeah? Okay, I will need a quick moment here. So that we're clear. All right, so now moving to the amendment as amended, and I will ask the clerk to just read it now for clarity on the amendment now.
Just the first line, that the committee undertake a study of no more than 2 days, beginning no later than Monday, August 8th, 2022.
Okay.
And the rest remains the same.
Okay. So no discussion being, it seems no further discussion on the amendment. We'll go to the vote on the amendment. All those, are there any opposed to the amendment?
I'm so sorry, Chair. My internet lagged out and I missed exactly what the wording of the motion is. My sincerest
Okay,
apologies.
the amendment as amended, go ahead, Madam Clerk.
That the committee undertake a study of no more than 2 days, beginning no later than Monday, August 8th, 2022, and the remainder of the motion remains unchanged.
All right, discussion. Seeing none, we'll go to the vote on the amendment. Are there any opposed to the amendment and or desiring a recorded vote? I see no opposition to the amendment. The amendment is carried. We are now on the main motion as amended. Any discussion on the further discussion on the main motion? I see Ms. Khalid. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Please let me know if I'm frozen on the screen. There's a lot of internet usage happening in my Consett office today, and I'm lagging. I'm noticing on my end. Chair, like I mentioned earlier, I've been having discussions with a number of our colleagues with respect to, where are we going with this motion and what our objectives are. And I agree with my colleagues. It's important to hold institutions to account, but it's also important at the same time to ensure that there is trust in public institutions that is maintained at the same time. We, as committee members, are obligated, are responsible to ensure that we're walking that balance. We have great responsibility in not only protecting this public institution, but also in holding it to account, which is why I really agree with the principle of Monsieur Villemur and a lot of the conversations that have been happening today with respect to this debate. And I did mention to all of my opposition colleagues that if we really do want to get to the crux of where we are and what we're what we're trying to accomplish here with the RCMP and holding them to account. As I've suggested this, in an informal setting to all of the members here, that the study or certain aspect of it may be better suited if they're indeed placed in NSICOP, which is the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, where classified documents can be looked at, where classified conversations can happen while still maintaining the importance of public trust in institutions and still holding organizations like the RCMP to account. And I understand that that members would like to have that conversation in a more public forum, which obviously restricts the ability of us to ask those classified questions which we may not get answers to, or to receive those classified documents which we may not receive because of the sensitive nature of this. So, I have had these conversations with members of opposition, specifically when it comes to 2 paragraphs in the main motion, and I will move that we remove these 2 paragraphs from the main motion, and I would love to hear all sides of this conversation in this meeting. So, Mr. Chair, without further ado, I move that the main motion be amended by deleting that the committee request by Thursday, August 4, 2022, that the RCMP provide a list of warrants obtained, if any, for each use of such software, as well as the scope of the warrants and the reasons for the monitoring. That the committee also request by Thursday, August 4, 2022, a list of warrants or any other information related to the wiretapping of members of parliament, parliamentary assistants, or any other employee of the Parliament of Canada. And I would like to, draw your attention to a number of issues that I think are pertinent here. One being that this is pretty overbroad. I mean, if I wanted to go through a list of members of Parliament in the past who have had warrants against them, Bruce Carson, Arthur Porter, Patrick Brazeau, Pamela Wallin. There's a number of senators, Finley and Gerstein. There's Mike Duffy. There's Michael Sona, and there's Jack Layton. I could continue on and on. So I really think that we need to understand where it is that we're trying to go with this. I mean, having a list of all members of parliament that have ever had a warrant put out for them, have gone to jail, in the history of our parliament, is not going to lead to the objectives that we're trying to get to. And those objectives, from my understanding, and I would love for Mr. Villemure to correct me if I'm wrong, is to make sure that the RCMP is respecting the privacy rights of Canadians. Now, it's kind of a long stretch for that to happen, based on the wording of this motion. Obviously, we have the ability to amend or to add additional witnesses as may be, depending on how this warrants section plays out. Which is something to be considered at a later time. But I also think that this really hits at the crux of our public institutions and the trust within them. I've heard members today talk about Pegasus like it was a fact of usage. And I'm not saying that it is or it isn't. That's what this whole exercise is about. What I would like to know is if there's information out there that members are privy to about the usage of this, I would like to know about it, because in the text of the motion, it seems like it is really direct that yes, this is happening, and we would like for us as this committee to see a list of all of the warrants that have been put out. And to me, that seems a little disingenuous in that we haven't received that information yet from the RCMP. And at that same time, I understand that we've not had a pleasant experience with the RCMP with respect to the facial recognition study that has been ongoing. And I am in no way defending their practices. In fact, I agree with my members to say, they should be held to account. But at the same time, I don't want to create a fear frenzy or to use fear, to put forward or to expand on partisan issues, or to have the head of somebody, as other members have said to me, off the record. So what I would like to do is to see those two paragraphs removed. I, on principle, would like to see that moved to NSI COP so that we can have those fulsome, truthful discussions in a setting that is great for and good for our public security, our national security, while also holding the RCMP to account. I don't think that this committee is the right place for this. And Mr. Chair, given all of those arguments that I've made, I put it to you to let me know if my amendment's in order, and looking forward to debate on this from other members. Thanks.
Your amendment is indeed in order. So we will debate the amendment henceforth. If you're finished, I will go to Monsieur Villemure. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. This amendment, I think, would deprive the motion of any meaning whatsoever. You're talking about transferring our study on national security. Perhaps the RCMP would answer more freely, but let's not mistake substance for shadow. I mean, we can't. We have to know what's happening. There were documents produced by the House of Commons confirming that the RCMP did not have warrants in about 10 cases. Now, these are official documents of the House of Commons, so I'm not asking to have a list of all parliamentarians who were wiretapped or monitored electronically with Pegasus. I want to know what's happening. And if something did happen, I think that these two paragraphs have to remain as such, because it's possible that the RCMP has, without a warrant, monitored Canadian citizens and possibly parliamentarians. So if we take this out, we won't be able to know whether the surveillance was legal or not. So I don't want to see this motion emptied of its substance. There's something else. We all accept that we're working in the public interest, and all have said this since we began this meeting. But what I'm seeing on the part of Liberal colleagues are amendments that are taking us away from public interest. There may be nothing, and if there's nothing, I'll be happy, but we shouldn't limit the scope of our study, hoping that it will have it will do what we want. I think we have to work with goodwill and not deal with these dilatory amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You called me to the floor? It didn't come through on my...
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. There's a bit of a lag for whatever reason with comms today. But I'll just say this, that I want to keep these two paragraphs intact. I do believe that if we talk about trust in public institutions, Mr. Chair, as Ms. Khalid has presented as her argument as to why these paragraphs should be deleted, I think it actually undermines our democratic institutions. That people want to know that when parliamentarians ask for the production of documents, especially from the RCMP, who, as Ms. Khalid pointed out, in our study on facial recognition technology, on their metadata monitoring that's happened in the past. We also talk about Public Health Agency of Canada monitoring movements of Canadians using technology. We need to know what's happening, and we have to be completely transparent here. By removing these paragraphs will look more like a cover-up rather than being accountable. And so I want to make sure that we bring this all forward. The parliamentarians and parliamentary staff that the Liberals pointed out are all already public information. It's out there, people know about it. I don't want to be undermining, any criminal investigations that are happening right now. That is something that I am cognizant of, and I don't want to make that information public. That's why this is going to be submitted to the committee. The committee will decide what we release to the public, and I think that that's covered off through the motion. So I think that we want to be very cautious on how we deal with it, including on issues of national security. But we don't want the RCMP to use the guise of national security or public safety as a way to pull a veil over this information and hide it from parliamentarians, and ultimately the findings that we have as committee and report back to Parliament and to Canadians in general. So let's leave it as is, and then we can move forward as how we best discern that information and put it into our report.
Thank you. Ms. Khalid.
Thanks, Chair. To be completely honest, I didn't really understand where Mr. Bazan was going with that argument. I think it's, because I've said this before, it's really important us as parliamentarians to be responsible for what we're saying. And it's one thing to make accusations and then recall them later. I think it's more responsible for us to actually ask these questions of the RCMP before the committee, before we say, okay, now produce these documents. We don't know if these documents exist. I know that members have said Pegasus or these documents and that documents and those warrants, and speaking like they're matters of fact. We in fact don't know that they're matters of fact. And I think that we are able to revisit whether these documents are needed or not after we've had those conversations in our committee, in a public setting with the RCMP, being before us. And the second thing that I just want to also outline, something that Mr. Bazan said, was that the confidentiality potentially of these documents are covered in the motion. I don't think that the confidentiality of these documents is indeed covered in the text of the motion as it is presented before us. I think if that is a conversation that we need to have, then we should definitely be having it. I mean, there is a responsibility that comes with parliamentary privilege. And I think that we should be very, very judicious in the accusations that we make without the proof, without a shred of evidence before making these accusations or saying that this is actually a matter of fact and reality. Maybe we should be bringing in the RCMP first and saying, all right, guys, these are our concerns. And based on what they respond with, we can then call in to say, okay, you know what, we need these documents from you guys. And then we can discuss under what circumstance and what parameters we would be receiving those documents. I absolutely agree with my colleagues that we need to hold public institutions to account within that whole framework of privacy and ethics and access to information. I think that we should be doing it in a more responsible way, in a more reasonable way, as opposed to whatever sticks first and then ask questions later. I think we should be asking the questions first and then requesting what documents need to be requested. And, we try to be as collaborative as possible on this committee to ensure that the nonpartisan, the important work for the protection of rights of Canadians is maintained through this committee. And I hope that we can continue to work in that way as these 2 meetings, these 2 days, my apologies, progress for this study specifically. Thanks, Chair.
Mr. Williams is next. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, from you and bonjour de l'École Française à Quebec. Mr. Villemure, I'm in your province and learning a little bit, not too much. But I just wanted to add a word in we haven't used or heard yet, which is regulation. We talked and we heard about general operations, and certainly we just came off of a study where we talked about regulation. I think from our perspective, the whole purpose of this study is to look at regulations that may not exist at all, and the use again and perhaps the exploitation of privacy. And that's why some of those witnesses have been called forward, and certainly because the public safety minister, because that still is under the purview. I disagree with the notion this is a witch hunt. Our whole premise in this committee is to look at what regulations we can recommend to Parliament to protect Canadians as a whole. And when we've seen from the last study or two that technology, when it advances, the government does not keep up with that. We do see exploitation and we see problems with that, and that affects Canadians, and that's the whole committee's work. In that end, when we have witnesses and we ask for certain witnesses or evidence, that evidence becomes part of what we make for recommendations to correct that and to correct any exploitation or anything else that may be perceived as happening or may be happening. So I don't agree that we should be putting that aside or in the back burner or taking it away from public view. The public are absolutely entitled to see what is there. And I think furthermore to that, the premise of and the background of the actual ask for this committee report is from already public information that was reported. So I think in that end, keeping that main topic of regulation as the forefront and looking to make sure we as parliamentarians are making recommendations of regulations to protect privacy of Canadians and perhaps parliamentarians. That's the reason for this study. And I think from that, we need to be cognizant it needs to be then public in that regard, so that when we make recommendations, the public understand why and where that came from. So just my point. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
And now, Monsieur Villemure.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to correct something. We're not accusing anyone of anything. We want to learn. Now, what we have comes from published by the House of Commons, June 22nd, and these have to do with electronic surveillance in 2022. So this is not a witch hunt. In this document, 132 pages long, there's not much. But in some sections, they talk about surveillance without warrants and with no reasons provided. So for the time being, this document should be clarified. And the questions I would put have to do with this document. There are no accusations. We're looking into things, and this isn't being done. This is being done based on a report published by the House of Commons. We need information in order to answer questions that are raised by this document. So I insist on the fact that we should keep these two paragraphs. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to read out a portion of what I'm proposing be deleted from the motion, and it says that the committee also request by Thursday, August 4, 2022, a list of warrants or any other information related to the wiretapping of members of Parliament, parliamentary assistants, or any other employee of the Parliament of Canada. To me, that is not a question. That is a statement that says, RCMP, you have been doing this. Now show us the paper trail or the paperwork to go behind this. So when I read this motion, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I see that this is making a statement of fact, or that's what it reads like. So I again stand by what I'm saying. This is not seeming to be a fact-finding expedition. It seems like opposition members have already set their minds on what the facts are and are now looking to back it up with documents that we know are not going to be provided. We know that this is not the right forum for these conversations to happen. So, again, to the members, folks, we need to walk that fine balance. Public institutions trust is important by Canadians. Yes, we need to hold them to account. I do not think that we should be making these kind of accusations, because that is what it reads from the motion, without first having those discussions, those conversations with the RCMP, the people involved. And based on those discussions, we can ask for whatever documents we want. I just feel that those discussions need to happen first before we make these accusatory comments about them. Thanks, Chair.
Monsieur Vermeulen.
Je rejette.
Well, I reject the accusation that I'm making an accusation. We're not accusing anyone here. We simply want to shed light on things that were put in a public document. It's pure accountability. There are details that could remain confidential, but the very essence of our study is why, for what purpose, by whom, and of whom. And the committee here is the ideal forum for this sort of thing. And in various drafts of the motion, there are no accusations. There is a request to look into a matter. So what I want is to know. I'm not saying I accuse anyone, so be careful of the vocabulary you use. My colleague is saying this, but there are no accusations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think we've exhausted the speaking list, and so the motion, I put the question to the committee. Are there any opposed to the motion? Okay.
Opposed. Recorded vote.
Okay.
Isn't it the amendment?
We have. Sorry, we're on the amendment. All right. I see Monsieur Vermeulen. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Au fin de...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In order to clarify, I want to be clear on what we're voting on. I want everyone to understand.
Lost my sense of clarity around that too, so thank you. We are voting on the amendment to delete the second and third paragraph, and I heard a request for a recorded vote, so I will turn it over to the clerk for a recorded vote on the amendment to the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Baines.
I vote yes.
Madame Brière.
Oui.
Mr. Naqvi.
Yes.
Ms. Khalid.
I vote yes.
Ms. Shanahan.
Oui.
Mr. Bazan.
Opposed.
Mr. Shields.
Opposed.
Mr. Williams.
I vote no.
Monsieur Villemur.
Je suis contre.
Mr. Green.
I vote no.
Yes. Pour 5, nays contre 5.
All right, and I vote against the motion.
Yes, pour 5, nays contre 6.
Okay, the motion is defeated. Back to the main motion. Is there any further discussion or amendments to the main motion? Ms. Khalid.
Thanks, Chair. I was just wondering, in that case then, as we look to submit any additional witnesses, as is contemplated in the motion, how long, what's the timeline like in terms of getting those names? I mean, if I, for example, wanted Mr. Harper to come to talk about his AI and Pegasus involvements, how much of a time frame would we need to make sure that he's available to come to this committee?
Given that you've suggested the intention to do so publicly, perhaps you're giving the maximum time that could be allowed. So thank you for doing so. I would suggest that anybody with, and if you indeed have any other suggestions for witnesses that you have already contemplated, that you supply them to the clerk as soon as possible. The motion, well, I mean, as always, the sooner the better. So I don't see a deadline for witnesses built into the motion, and I don't believe that one is necessary if I put it out there to all members that you will have the greatest odds of getting your witness, I think, if you give the maximum amount of time for the clerk to contact them. And I'll leave it at that. And although I do see Mr. Bazin and Monsieur Villemure. So go ahead, Mr. Bazin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd just say, I know in some of the discussions we're having concern about that this is a witch hunt and that, maybe we should limit, the information that we're getting. I would suggest that because of what's been made publicly available, that Pegasus started getting used by the RCMP, that they're doing the spyware starting in 2018 is what they've said, that maybe we set that as a time limit. We know that from public information that Pegasus has been around since 2016. So we may want to use those as kind of the dates to start with, and just saying, that information we're looking for starts at X day until the current time, so that we don't have the RCMP having to go back historically and a pile of records and combing through it on how many wiretaps they've issued since the advent of the telephone, right? So I would just say that it would be a more productive use of RCMP time and better for us to be more focused. So I'd like to propose the amendment that all information that's been requested by the RCMP start from the time frame of January 1st, 2016 until present.
Are you proposing this as an amendment to the motion?
Yes.
Okay.
So it would follow after the third paragraph.
Okay. I'm wondering if, given that I guess the third paragraph, that the committee request by Thursday, August 4th, the RSP provide a list of warrants obtained, if any, for each use of such software, almost has that built in, if we're talking about software that's only existed since 2016, but never mind, I point that out just for clarity. But
that's in the second paragraph, it's not in the third.
I take your point. Okay, well, your amendment is in order.
So unless we add that,
the clerk has asked. I'm going to ask you to repeat the precise amendment that you're proposing.
So I'm going to actually modify that, because I'll just add for each use of such software into the third paragraph. So we read the same way: a list of warrants or any other information related to the wiretapping for each use of such software of members of Parliament, and right there. I think just so we adopt the same wording that's in the second paragraph and insert it into the third for each use of such software.
So
I think that would cover it off.
After the comma where it says members of Parliament, or sorry, I guess you could, at the end of that sentence, wiretapping of members of Parliament, parliamentary assistants, or any other employee of the Parliament of Canada for each use of such software.
Yes.
Okay. So we have an amendment that is in order. I can see Monsieur Villemure and Ms. Khalid, followed by Ms. Khalid. So go ahead, Monsieur Villemure.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je voulais juste spécifier.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to specify that in the motion, we talk about providing witnesses within calling on witnesses within 7 days of the motion. Now, there's something I'm less familiar with in terms of procedure. The date January 1st, 2016, how should we proceed with this?
Donc, je vais chercher votre conseil là-dessus.
I'd like your advice on this, please.
Thank you.
I'm not using that date in the amendment to the motion. I'm just saying for each use of such software added to the end of the third paragraph. No date involved. Clear as mud?
It's clear to me.
Clear as mud, yes.
Yeah. Just one moment on the second point. Also, Renee, thank you for clarifying so that the additional witness list it is in your motion here to be submitted to the clerk within 7 days of the adoption of this motion. So if the motion is adopted today, members will have 7 days to supply their names to the clerk, and so that'll be that will give the sooner the better, as is always the case, and you're not limited. If you have a witness already in mind that you wish to call, you may do so, but that doesn't preclude you from adding witnesses afterward, and we will, of course, the clerk will do her best to give the any potential witness as much notice as possible to have the greatest possible participation in our meetings. Discussion on the amendment. I have Ms. Khalid.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just actually trying to understand. Is there a timeline on this, or is there not a timeline on this? So are there two? Sorry, if you could just read what is before us today, Chair, I'd appreciate that.
With regard to the witnesses, or with regard to
whatever the amendment is proposing.
Okay, the amendment had nothing to do with witnesses. Or didn't have to do with supplying the list of witnesses. The amendment was to add the words for each use of such software to that third paragraph, and what that does is captures how far back the RCMP has to go with respect to warrants. We're only dealing with these types of software. We are not going back deep into history and into old wiretaps that are not related to this software that we're studying.
Okay, so I mean, it's not limiting the RCMP as to specific, because I mean, my apologies, Mr. Chair. I'm a little bit confused because we're not exactly sure what kind of software we're talking about initially. Are we talking about Pegasus-like software? I see Mr. Bazan's nodding his head about Pegasus-like software. So what we're saying is we're not setting a timeline or a timeline on where those motions are produced, as long as they are linked to some software that is used by some RCMP officers with respect to some, wiretapping of members of parliament. Is that accurate?
Well, the motion uses the word spyware in its first sentence, and it carries on sorry, that's in the letter. The motion itself, the first paragraph, says device investigation tools, which I understand is a term that is used. I understand that's a term used by the RCMP, so that would hopefully capture whatever they would consider a device investigation tool, and also in the same sentence it refers to technological capabilities similar to Pegasus. So we've identified
so-
Pegasus, similar to Pegasus, device identification tools similar to Pegasus. I think that's all right there in the motion for clarity.
Okay. And just again, for further clarity, Chair, now my understanding is that the Pegasus spyware was developed in 2011, and that is not the same date as Mr. Bazan had initially said in 2016. So just so everybody's clear, that's what the expectation is as to when this software was developed, and that's how far back we're going.
I would, in reading this motion, I would presume that in order to comply with this motion, if it's passed, if the RCMP used such software at any time, going back to if 2011 is the development date of this software, and if it were in use by the RCMP, then that would be captured by this motion. I think that's why it's using that phrase of for each such software is better than a date, because it basically then gives us, so we're not guessing when these things were adopted or came into existence.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome. Any other discussion on the amendment? Is everyone in favor of the amendment? Are there any opposed to the amendment? Seeing no opposition to the amendment,
Sorry, Chair. I just wanted to canvass my members to see how they felt about it.
None of them are putting their hands up or looking at me as I say any opposed. So I don't see any opposition to the amendment, and unless.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify one last time, Chair. There's no dates that are proposed in this amendment. Yes.
No, I don't. There is not an explicit date in the amendment. We've just used the same language that's in the second paragraph into the third. Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Any other? Do you object to the amendment?
No,
Mr.
I'm
McNaghty?
just want to be absolutely clear what excuse me, what I'm voting on right now. So maybe if the clerk can read again precisely the language that is the amendment, or now that it's suggested the motion be read as, so that we're all clear as to what we're voting on. Thank you.
So you'd like me,
Madam Clerk?
you'd like me to read the whole motion?
Or just the relevant part will be sufficient. Thank
Relevant part is after the third paragraph, which begins that the committee also request, by Thursday, August 4, 22, a list of warrants. At the end of that paragraph, we would add after employee of the Parliament of Canada for each use of such software.
All right. I still have not seen any objection to the amendment, and seeing none nor a request for a recorded vote, I would declare the amendment, the motion amended. So we are now back to the main motion as amended. Is there any further discussion or debate or additional amendments to the main motion? Seeing no hands up and nobody wishing to speak, I will put the main motion to a vote. Are there any opposed to or requesting a recorded division on the main motion?
Request the recorded division, Chair.
Okay, so I will ask the clerk this time to record a vote on the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Baines.
I vote no.
Madame Brière.
Je vote non.
Mr. Nakvi.
No.
Ms. Khalid.
I vote no, Madam Clerk.
Ms. Shanahan.
No.
Mr. Bazan.
I'm in favor.
Mr. Shields.
In favor.
Mr. Williams.
In favor.
Monsieur Villemur.
Je suis pour.
Mr. Green.
I vote for the motion.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 5.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Yeas pour 6, nays contre 5.
I declare the motion carried. The purpose of this meeting was to deal with this motion, and unless there's any urgent business that would be both in order and that members would like to discuss, I'm going to declare the meeting adjourned. Any other urgent related relevant business? No. Seeing none, meeting adjourned.